Hello and a warm welcome to Personal Finance. I am Gugulethu Cele. Now on tonight's edition of the show, we find out how South African consumers go about with their banking. Do you use cash, your card, or make use of technology devices and options that have been made available to South African consumers? And also, at what kind of cost implication does this come at? I've got two guests with me this evening to guide us through the details. Firstly, we've got Dr Henk Pretorius, who's the Chief Executive of Columinate and Cowyk Fox, who's the Head of Cards at ABSA. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I won't get too personal and ask you individually as to how you make use of your money, but I do a bit of card, I do a lot of technology, but unfortunately I have to keep cash on me sometimes to pay for your parking tickets when you pay the visit to the mall. But Henk, maybe if you can give us details about the average South African consumer. What trends do we use for banking?
I think the last 3 years especially has seen a massive change in the way in which people do their banking. I think even if we think back to 2011, it's amazing to me that none of the big banks in 2011, which is just 4 years ago, actually had a banking app.
Sure.
So, I mean, that's sort of a milestone, I think, in banking in South Africa and I think worldwide. The fact that more mobile applications, more tablet apps are available. I think in terms of how people still do their banking, there's still a lot of cash, there's still a lot of going into branches, there's still a lot of the traditional forms of banking, but I think there's definitely a trend towards becoming more digitally transformed as a banking sector locally.
Cowyk, to bring your voice into the conversation, everyone does say cash is king, but hey, cards are also something that consumers find very difficult to pull themselves away from lately.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I would agree with what Henk is saying. Certainly, I think there's been a proliferation of digital solutions to consumers out there. The mobile is making the way people engage their daily lives significantly different. And I think we're seeing the same. Cash, I think, will always be big. Even in sophisticated markets, we see 30 to 50% of payments still being done on cash. Cards have been very successful. It's open systems. They work anywhere in the world, no matter who you bank with. They're safe, secure, they're cheap. So they've been very, very successful. And I see the digital platforms adopting the card system behind it, to support the growth in digital forms of payment.
Cowyk, to stay with you, maybe if we talk about the fees and the cost implications of these, because all of them carry some kind of certain amount of risk, and it's been well documented in South Africa that maybe swiping your card is the cheaper option for the South African consumer. Is this still true?
I think it varies by customer. I think digital payments, should be cheaper. Generally, they are cheaper. The banks typically incentivize the adoption of digital payments through special pricing offers, which makes them a lot cheaper than traditional ways of paying. The comparison with cash is always difficult, depending on what you look at. But I think people are adopting digital for a number of reasons, because cash is dangerous to carry, particularly in certain environments. So it's not just about cost; it's about security, it's about speed, it's about reliability and acceptance all over the place. But certainly, going from traditional and adopting digital should save consumers generally a significant number of costs in terms of banking.
You mentioned incentives. Henk, I'm not too sure if this is actually what's driving the change for South African consumers. Is that what you find in compiling your research?
I think the interesting thing is if you objectively compare costs between different banks and different channels, then it's certainly true that a lot of the digital options are far cheaper, independent of which bank you choose to compare those costs within. I think the difficulty is there are a lot of consumers who are not aware of the specific costs of banking. I think all of the research that we do show that it's quite difficult. Even if you go to one of the big banks' websites today, there's normally a 60 to 100-page document that you need to download to actually figure out what you individually would pay. Now, if you imagine just a typical person out there, it makes it very difficult to actually compare and know what the total sum is of the cost that I will pay at the end of the month if I do digital versus traditional banking. So, yes, I completely agree with digital being cheaper, but I think the communication about the benefits of those costs, I think that's where a lot of times consumers get stuck.
Is the onus on the consumer then to try to get more information there?
I'd say yes, certainly, but I think the information that's out there is very difficult to digest. I think a lot of banks will accept that because of the nature in which they are typically run, with digital being one of the channels, not necessarily competing, but trying to integrate across all of these channels and getting a consistent platform for costing in place is quite difficult. So some banks are doing it better than others. There are models out there, even in South Africa, where there are these accounts that for a single fee, you get a certain amount of transactions, independent of digital or not. And I think those are quite successful in explaining to consumers exactly what you'll pay. It makes it much more transparent. But I think there's a lot of communication that still needs to go out to explain exactly what you pay for when you actually do digital banking.
I want us to zone into digital for a moment because there are various options. We mentioned the USSD codes, which for the viewers at home is the star triple what hash codes that you actually make use of. There are also mobile apps as well as internet banking. Again, to stick with you, Henk, just for a moment, the kind of trends that we're seeing there, is it the younger consumer who's more actively participating in the digital age?
5 years ago, if you had asked me that question, I would have had to say yes. I think the 25 to 34 sort of young working class individual predominated in terms of online banking. I think the trend now is much more towards even older consumers, people who've been banked for 30 or 40 years are now coming onto online and digital platforms. I think in terms of one of the trends that we see is that people aren't necessarily abandoning the traditional online banking website to migrate only to digital mobile channels. What's actually happening is they're expanding the repertoire of the ways in which they can do banking. So it's been one of the key findings in the study that we've done for the last 4 years is that people seem to be adding, 3 years ago, they added a mobile phone onto the repertoire of things that they normally bank with. And currently it's a tablet. So either through a tablet app or maybe even the tablet mobile browser. But it's not a complete neglection of that traditional website via online banking.
Cowyk, you were nodding your head, so clearly you're agreeing with these things.
I fully agree. I think it's not an either or. It's how people integrate the real world with the digital world. You know, there's two particular trends I think that we've seen. If you look at where people spend in the real world or in the digital space, you know, initially with the internet through desktops, that's where it all happened. We're now seeing people shopping online using the mobile app instead of a desktop type device, growing at 6 times the rate as what we're seeing on desktop. So it's a clear migration of a laptop or a desktop onto a mobile phone, just because of convenience, but it's still shopping online. But we're seeing the growth through the mobile piece. And then the second part is where we see how people are starting to integrate the online shopping experience with the real world. So for example, and it goes both ways, where they will go into a real store, look for what they want, maybe try it on, test it, and then leave the store and shop online for the best price. Or they'll surf online because it's easy to find and you don't have to walk around so much to find the right product, but have it delivered to a store and pick it up and test it before they actually take it. So people are using, it's the merging of the two worlds rather than them living their separate lives.
To play devil's advocate, there's a lot of risk involved, and we hear about the concerns regarding, you know, the online scams and people's accounts getting hacked. And just a few years ago, that was always in the headlines with regard to people's personal identification and the one-time passwords also being used to access their accounts. Cowyk, to stay with you, is that still a key concern for a lot of your consumers? And in your interactions with them, and even when you plan new products for them, how big of an influence does this play?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, before anybody's going to use any sort of payment, you know, trust and security is front of mind. The moment you go digital, it's available essentially, and it needs to be protected. You know, but cash has got risks to it as well. You know, personal risk and that sort of thing. So risk is nothing new to payments. It's different types of risk. I think the digital environment obviously makes it available. But I think the industry globally as well as locally has done a lot of investment making those as secure as using cash. Nowadays with the chip and pin technology, the 3D secure online technology, if used properly and if people look after themselves and go to proper sites, it's as safe as paying with cash in the real world. But I think it's really important people understand that when they go digital, it's available. So you got to be knowing what you do, apply the right principles, and then within that system, you'll be protected.
Henk, just to get your voice with regard to the safety and security issues, but more importantly also, the ecosystem overall seems to be adapting, because not only can we just bank using, you know, technology, but there's data, there's airtime. One can even play the lotto.
One of the major things that has always surprised me with especially around the internet banking work that we do, is that one of the most common things that people do in internet banking is actually not banking. They do things like buy airtime, you've mentioned that, they buy data, and in our latest survey of 2015, about 80% of people across all of the major banks buy airtime via their online banking. It's also, incidentally, one of the biggest things that they do on mobile banking. So even more people buy airtime on a mobile phone via the banking app than they actually make payments. So it's sort of this, it doesn't completely represent a shopping experience yet. I wouldn't say these are, these fun places that people go. It's still very much for transactional activities and banking. But there is a sense that people want to do more than just, look up payments, load beneficiaries, and, pay their grocery bills, for example. I think banks are doing, putting more features out there, and people are definitely responding to it.
Time now to get our important notes to self for the consumer out there who needs to, the key points. Henk, let's start off with you, that they need to take into consideration about the various options that they can do their banking and even transacting via.
I think the first thing I would advise is when deciding on a channel to use, whether to use mobile phones or internet banking, for example, it's always going to come down to the benefit versus cost. I think the banks are available to make that. I mean, if you just do a simple search on Google, you'll find the information. So firstly, go and look for the information and find out about the cost. They are available. And I think the second thing that I feel quite strongly is educate yourselves about the risks of particular ways of banking. I mean, the information is out there, and often user accounts get compromised not due to a failure on the bank security systems, but due to a user actually providing information to someone that can breach their account. So I think those 2 points are very important. Saving costs, going directly to the bank and understanding the costs, and secondly, educating yourselves about the risks and potential fraud you may become a victim of.
Cowyk, to come to you.
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I would say that there's so much choice out there nowadays. It adds to the complexity, but if you do the research and understand what is it that you need, you'll find a digital solution that can halve your banking cost in terms of doing your payments. And then I think when you decide to adopt those, understand the risks, make sure you understand the security solutions out there, make use of it. And very importantly, look after your personal data. As the industry has secured the payments, the syndicates are looking into identity theft, as the way around it. So just look after yourself, but then it should all be fine.
Well, that's where we have to leave it for personal finance. Some interesting insights from both our guests this evening. Do your homework, understand the kind of platforms that you'll be using, but more importantly, it just makes life so much more convenient, I think, if anything. A big thank you to both our guests, Dr. Henk Pretorius, he's the Chief Executive of Columinate, as well as Cowyk Fox, he's the Head of Cards at ABSA. Do be sure to share your insights with us on personal finance. Until next time, have a wonderful evening.